So today we're going to be doing a comprehensive review of the Specialized Enduro. We're going to be going in depth into bike setup, suspension, sizing, geometry, cockpit setup. So if you've got the bike or you're in the market for one, there's going to be a ton of valuable information either way. I brought in our resident Enduro expert, Nick Doman. He's owned both sizes, the S3 and the S4, and raced it on the EWS. We've both got a lot to say about this bike, so let's get into it. To start, Nick, you've ridden this bike a lot. Maybe just like summarize your experience with the Enduro.
Yeah, so back in 2021, I bought an S3 and used that as the race bike for that season. Overall, I was very happy with that bike. It was a big step up from the bike I was riding the previous year in terms of geometry and just overall package. I feel that the bike just does everything pretty well. Doesn't have any major downsides, which for a race bike is good. Over the course of that race season, I started running my stack higher and higher. That is one thing with this S3 that is not great, is the head tube is super short. And then if you have a super short head tube and say 20 mil a stack and 180 mil fork, and you hit a bump or like a bigger impact, your handlebars just drop away from you. So that's like not good, especially like over in Europe. Like I learned a lot over there. Like the riding is very, very different. Bike setup is very, very different. I had to run my bars a lot higher. And the problem is as you raise your stack a bunch, the bike shrinks. The reach comes in and then it just becomes very small. Like the bike's kind of small to begin with, and then you do that and it becomes even smaller. So that my thought process was, let's go to the S4 and then I can run my bars a hell of a lot higher and it should actually be in like a pretty good spot, which ended up being pretty accurate. I might have gone too high at one point, but it's better, you got to try that to know. And overall, like I found that the S4's body position, like my attack position was a little bit better, but then there was also other drawbacks because of the bigger bike. So at the end of the day, like if I had to pick one, I would still go to the S3, even though it's smaller, because I prefer the way it handles.
I think during the same season you were racing that, I went through a really similar size journey with the Pivot Phoenix I was racing. I had a Phoenix Enduro bike and I started out on the large, which had a 460 reach and a 443 chainstay, which I think is damn near the same as this. And then midway through the season, I was raising my bars and then ended up on the XL, which has a 485 reach, which is coincidentally the same as the large. So yeah, I think it's a testament to the Enduro that we're still talking about this bike and it's still relevant. Like when did this thing come out?
I think 2019.
And like at that time, it was a pretty revolutionary bike, like one of the first 29-inch long travel Enduro bikes. And I mean, countless bikes have come out with almost the exact same geometry, very similar travel packages, and yeah, however many years later, like it's still a super relevant and high performing bike. Yeah, I think Nick and I's overall impression of the bike is really positive. I feel like it's a solid package. I think the suspension works really well. It's a really easy bike to get along with, but I think for us, we're both pushing these bikes to go racing. And I think even when we're not racing, that's just where our minds are at, is like, how does the bike handle in a race situation? Does it give me confidence, and is it fast? And I think when I start pushing this thing and pushing my limits, that's when I feel like the bike starts to have a few quirks that are a little hard to work around at times. Like, how would you evaluate the suspension performance?
It's pretty good. Like the bottom line is it's pretty darn good. I will say one thing is when they released this bike, they used the big rearward wheel path like everyone was doing, and this bike does not have a rearward wheel path at all. Like if you go on the linkage software, big nerd guy over here, but like other people have modeled it and stuff, and you can see that the typical FSR, they move pretty close to a straight line, which is fine. I think it has quite a high leverage rate, which can be a little bit challenging to work around, which it kind of sits into the travel really well because of that. And if you don't run a stiff enough spring, like this is what I found with the bike is The suspension's pretty darn good if you're not really pushing the pace, but then as soon as you start to push the pace, you need to add support into the suspension, be that compression or volume spacers or however else you feel like doing that, or spring rate. And then it almost in a way like chokes up to where it feels like the suspension doesn't know what it's doing. And then as a result, the chain goes wild. That's like the one biggest drawback, or like I would say the single biggest flaw with this bike, regardless of size for me, is the amount of chain slap it gets. I don't know where that comes from, but, and I'm not the only person that says this. Other people I know that have had this bike, it's the same thing. This bike, one of the biggest things you should do if you do own this bike is get a full chain guide with the bottom roller, back like it's 2008. Like this bike will drop chains. Like that's like its one weird glaring downside is the bike will drop chains.
Yeah, when you're really cooking it through some wild stuff, the chains having a party back there. And I feel like that's part of the reason why some of the teams run O-chain too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I actually, when I was going from the S3 to the S4 on the O-chain topic, I did get an O-chain. They're painfully expensive, but I think it's a cool product that I really wanted to try. And with hopes of mitigating that problem with this bike, because I did have the chain drop. Weirdly enough, it's like only in races though. Like I almost never had the chain drop just riding, but a couple times in races I had the chain drop, and it just like it's unfortunate. Like you're trying to go fast, and then you're like, all of a sudden your cranks are jammed up and your chain's off, and you're just like, well, I guess I'm coasting this one because the chain's off. So like, which can be dangerous too. Like that can lead to bad crashes, and like you never want your chain to throw. So full chain guide is, I would say, like if you're racing, 100% get a full chain guide. That was one thing I observed over in Europe, is all of the Specialized like EWS high level pro guys all had full chain guides. So that was another like, okay, these guys have this problem too. And they're obviously way faster than what I can ride a bike, and way better. But like, that's the point, is like there was a correlation between what I was thinking and what they were doing. So that was cool to see. But yeah, the O-chain, like if you've never ridden one, it is, I think, a cool product. It did help with the bike. The suspension is like I said, pretty solid. It just becomes a little weird when you start adding a bunch of valving to it. It just starts to it isn't as happy.
Yeah.
And then
it is a high leverage ratio bike. So kind of what you're saying, like I feel like it's really active off the top and it feels good, but then that kind of translates, like what you were saying, into maybe a bit of a wallowy problem, because the leverage ratio is so high and I don't think it falls off super quickly. I haven't looked at the chart. This is just what it feels like, and then it just starts to live deeper in the travel when you're dealing with like really big compressions and stuff. And I don't want to go super in depth, but like Nick's running a full RockShox setup, I'm running a full Öhlins, and I think it's kind of on par with what you would expect from the brands. Riding Nick's bike, it's super active. It's like a traction machine, and it's really sweet, but maybe not as much support. And then this Öhlins coil is almost the other way around. It's got a ton of support, but sacrifices a little bit of that chattery stuff, which I feel like if I was racing this bike, I would prefer to have this setup. Yeah, just because I feel like it deals with that higher leverage ratio a little better.
I would agree as well. I've actually never really ridden Öhlins until like this last weekend, riding that bike a couple times, and it was pretty crazy just the difference in feel between the two brands. Like I've ridden RockShox probably like 5 years. I haven't had anything but, and I'm very used to how it feels. It's, I'd say, definitely a softer, more comfort driven kind of feel. It's definitely not like, you know, it's not slow by any means, or it's just like, it's more comfortable than say like Öhlins you get in it. And once again, I've never driven like a supercar or like a super crazy nice car, but you know, like you don't want to go drive a Porsche for like 6 hours on a bumpy road. It'd probably be kind of uncomfortable, but the performance is there. So like that was something that's very apparent with the Öhlins, is like when you press into that rear shock, like on a compression, it goes forward, it has drive. Whereas like this is a little bit more like kind of sits in, and then, so it's a little bit lazier, I guess you could say.
I'd agree.
I'd say it's a lazy feel. There's nothing wrong with it. Like, you know, when you need grip, it's there. So it's just a very different different approach, and it was cool to experience that on, you know, a platform that I have some experience with.
Nick and I think, ride really similarly. We both like to stand up on the bike. We're both racing, so we've gone back and forth on this a lot in our own time, and we do have a lot of the same experiences with a lot of the same bikes. But with this one, we, I think, have a similar struggle with it, with the balance of the bike, and which makes it a little tough to deal with the sizing and a little tough to deal with when you're pushing it really hard. But it all comes down, I think, to the numbers and the geometry. So Nick, you've got the numbers. Let's talk about the balance of the bike and kind of how that changes in between the S3 and the S4.
All right, first I gotta say, before you listen to me rant about this, you should go watch the video that Steve from Vorsprung did on advanced bike geometry. That's what this comes from, and this is just like my application of the information he put out there. This is not original to me. I'm just, once again, applying it to these bikes and bikes I've ridden in the past, because I feel like it does give you a good idea of how the bike is going to handle, definitely from a perspective of turning or cornering, which for me is extremely important. Like I feel like I can compensate for other handling issues in bikes, but cornering is one that's just very difficult. And if you're coming into a turn and you're like, I don't really know what the bike's gonna do, it's a really bad feeling. And like,
it's not fast and it's not fun.
Yeah, like you're gonna be like, I've had bikes where I'm just like, I don't know what this is gonna do, and like a lot of different corners, and like maybe that's rider error, and I'm not a very good bike rider, but it's also like, it's also part of it is how the bike works. And so we'll just go with the main concept here is front rear ratio. So to do this simply, you take your wheelbase, you subtract your rear center, and then that gives you the front center. You divide your front center by your rear center, and that gives you a ratio. So for that number on the S3, you get a 1.83. This is another crazy thing, is these numbers don't change that much, but I swear on the trail you can feel this. Maybe not everyone can, but I can certainly feel the difference, say in 0.05 of this ratio, and that is the difference between these two bikes. So S3, once again, is a 1.83 front center rear center ratio, and the S4 is a 1.88, which in real world application is like non-existent, but with this it actually makes a difference, and I guarantee you if you rode the bikes back to back, you probably could feel this too. So back to Brian.
With that number that Nick's talking about, the front to rear center ratio, how that shows up for me in the S4 is just vagueness in the front end when cornering on like less supported corners. It feels like the front end, it's what Nick was describing earlier. I'm not exactly sure what it's gonna do. And I have like a video clip that I think shows the feeling fairly well. Like, I feel like I'll go into a corner, initiate to what I think my line is, and then I end up coming out feeling like stuck, where the front end's like wandering away and I feel like powerless to do anything about it. I feel like if I put more weight into it and like try and save it, it's just gonna wash. But then if I go the other way and relax the steering, I'm just gonna keep carving wider. So I kind of just feel like stuck in this position. And then it just brings a feeling of like a little bit of uncertainty to what the front end's gonna be doing when you're fighting for traction. And then I feel like when I'm riding the bike, I'm having to manage that feeling a lot and having to do things like initiate a drift with the rear to make sure that my front end isn't gonna wash. Because once the rear stepped out, like you're pretty locked into a drift and your front end's not gonna wash once your rear sliding. Or I'll choose one place to turn and be really confident that I can just turn in that one place and avoid kind of like that corner entry moment where I'm like initiating a turn, but I'm not sure if that front end is gonna go. So it just brings a little bit more thought and compensation into my riding. And my hypothesis is that I feel like because they're growing the reach and not the chainstay, there's just progressively less and less weight on the front wheel. I'm not sure if that's actually true, but I feel like on the longer chainstay bikes I've ridden, I feel like I'm just like standing on a longer lever, and regardless of where my weight is actively on the bike, the front end just feels more planted, and like it is just, I feel more connected to what the front wheel is doing. This bike, it feels light until I have to actively like weight it by like leaning forward and like pushing my body weight into the turn. But then it's another compensation, and I'm having to do this a bit of a seesaw thing where I'm kind of up over the front of the bike to corner, but then I'm kind of like back into my normal riding position. And yeah, when I'm going fast and fighting for traction, it's a little bit tougher to get around that characteristic for me.
I would second that on that bike. For me, it doesn't feel as natural, and that you're having to think about what you're doing instead of just doing it, which is, it's kind of annoying. And yeah, like for me, the turning difference, basically I feel like on the bigger bike, your hands are like slightly to the side, and the front tire is going to, like, it's harder to arc corners with it, because like say you're in a berm, it's almost like your front wheel's 2 inches up higher in the berm than where your rear tire is. And that goes for any corner, but like berms, you can really see like how much higher the front wheel is. And this is the same on any bike, but then it's just more exaggerated when you have that front center ratio that's farther apart. And that's just one thing that I did struggle with on that bike, was especially just cornering. And then kind of what Brian said is, it's like you're approaching a corner and you have to pick a pocket to like put the bike into the pocket and then bounce out. And it's not like, as I like riding like wide round corners. So for me, like the S3 just feels very natural. It does that very well. And then the S4, yeah, it's just tricky to corner. And then also the other thing is, like, to get it sometimes to turn tight, like you really do have to get the rear to slide or break it loose to get it to pivot. And then like the front will hold, but the rear otherwise it's just kind of like, it does this weird, almost jackknifey thing. So you have to like really get that rear to slide, which is like fun. Drifting's fun, but drifting is also like you're either pushing too hard or
it's
it's
inconsistent. Like I feel like I'm able to ride this bike good. Like some of the clips we got riding it, a lot the other day, it's like there's moments where I'm like, sick, I ripped that. But I think it's like the consistency at which you can do that suffers when you're having to manage a bit of an imbalance, which I feel like this bike has. So I feel like its ceiling is still really high. I have moments which are killer on it. I just don't feel like I can achieve my riding potential all the time as consistently. Me going to the S3, it's just a little bit of a bigger difference being on that small of a bike. And I'm kind of with Nick, like it corners way better. I feel a lot more confident in the front wheel, and it feels more natural to ride in that way. But then like if you're pushing race speeds on like faster and rougher tracks, then it just gets like a little dicey, because you just don't have that wheelbase. And then that's the trade-off, is like you get the wheelbase on the S4 and it feels great, but the maneuverability and corner confidence suffers.
I'd say the ultimate trade-off is you have maneuverability and stability. So let's pick which one you want to go for. And I guess another thing to add, though, that's something to definitely consider, right, is you could have two people that are 5'10", and they're going to have different body proportions. So like that's part of the reason I prefer, say, the S3, is I have like long legs and a like regular torso. So for me, where the legs put me on the bike, like I don't have super long arms, so I can't, the super long reach. Basically, if I'm on a bike with a really long reach, I feel like I'm tipping over because I'm just put farther back, and then I'm having to like reach for the handlebars, and I feel like I'm tipping, which I don't like. So that's one thing to consider, is like you could also have somebody that's, the same height as me, but has shorter legs and a long torso, and like them reaching the handlebars on, say, the S4 is going to feel great. So it's also something to consider as different body proportions, which is, everyone's basically different. So that's another thing I'd say worth noting is like, also the other thing is knowing the terrain you ride. So like where I live, a lot of the trails are basically hiking trails and a lot of twisty turns and very tight trails. So trying to steer a bus down that is not ideal. So that's another reason why I'd say I would gravitate towards the, this shorter wheelbase. But if you're, ride somewhere where it's really fast, wide open and pretty rough and doesn't have a whole lot of turns or tight turns, then, go for the big long bike and you're gonna have a great time. So just kind of just what works for you, and ultimately it's up to you to figure that out. So this is some information to help guide in that direction.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about previously is like the setup window, especially with the bigger size. I feel like it becomes a lot more track specific, where you're having to, raise your bars for a steep track, but the already wandery front end feels even more wandery. So it's like if you took that setup to a flatter trail, it would feel horrible. And then, for me, I would put my bars down. Something I noticed is like if you run the rear a bit stiffer, it puts a little bit more weight on the front end, but then you're, making a sacrifice with the suspension. So I feel like you're kind of dancing around setup a little bit more because of that imbalance with the bike. And it took you a while to tune yours in.
Yeah, definitely. Like when I had the S4, it took me quite a long time to really get very comfortable on the bike. It took, it was a new experience riding a bike that big. So it definitely took a while to figure out and just experiment and just try a bunch of different things. That one thing I will say is that I found that running the rear shock, like probably around 29% sag, did help with turning quite a bit. And another one of our friends who's a talented bike rider as well has also ridden the bike. He said the same thing. So that was another good thing to consider is if you have one of these and you're struggling with cornering, reduce the sag to a little bit under 30%. It probably will help to get the bike to turn in a bit better. So that's something to consider.
Yeah. And I think we've been agreeing a lot, but one thing we touched on is like how to kind of deal with the wandery front end. I feel like I deal with that by lowering my stack to get my weight a little bit further forward. And I feel like that feels a little bit better with initiating the turn and holding that front end grip through the corner. But I think Nick had a bit of a different take on that.
Yeah, for me, like, as I stated previously, I definitely ran a much higher, that's pretty much the whole reason I went to the S4 was to run a much higher front end. And like I said, I did probably go too high and then ended up coming back down. But you kind of got to go there to figure out what is too much. And for me, like raising the front end helped a lot with it. I just had my hands in a much better place. And also, like, say you have a taller stack, I feel like it also helps with leverage to lean the bike over. That's one thing I find with the S4. To get that thing to turn, you definitely have to be aggressive and lean. Like, if you don't lean it, it doesn't like to turn. It's not a bike you can just turn the handlebars and it'll turn. It'll just kind of go straight. So you gotta, that was one thing for me that helped, was like putting the bars up tall, gives you good leverage. You just throw the bike down on the side and lean it in and it would turn. But, definitely required effort to get to turn, and it would. The other thing I would say, comparing the two bikes, at least for me, is like on the bigger bike, if you say you're like trying to push or in a race situation and you make a little mistake, this could go both ways. Like the bigger bike could save you and bail you out, but it also can say like, if you're pushing a little too hard, it'll run wide. I find for me, the issue with that is I would run wide through turns instead of like, you want to turn, the bike's like, no, I'm going straight. And sometimes, you'd have that where it would keep going. Once again, partially rider error, but it also just because you're a little bit more stretched out and have a little bit less control over the thing, that was something I experienced. Versus like the S3, which what I like is you're on that bike and it just does what you want it to do when you want it to do it. Like I don't know, I think it's just that shorter wheelbase, a little bit more balanced, and it really does make a big difference. So, I'm sure there's other factors that contribute to these things, but for me, in that simple term of like front rear ratio, I think that is it's just a good way to look at things.
Yeah, I feel like that's out of all the numbers out there in geometry, like that ratio is, I think, what says most about how the bike's going to ride, because that says a lot about how it's going to corner. And like me and Nick have said, that's pretty much why we ride bikes.
Yeah.
Is to throw them into corners. It's like jumps are cool, smashing rocks is also really fun, but like linking up good corners is the meat and potatoes of why we ride bikes. And that's why we're harping on all this stuff so bad, is because we just like ripping turns, and we want our bikes to allow us to do that. So for those of you who are still with us after that ridiculously long-winded talk about bike geometry, I guess the other things we can touch on is just like the build quality and kind of features of the bike. I mean, it's got a swap box. This is one of the first bikes that came out with that, and the whole industry's followed because, I mean, it's badass. It's nice to have a place to store your stuff. And then I think you can comment on kind of the build quality and durability.
From my experience, they hold up pretty well as long as I'd say rip everything apart once, clean, Loctite, grease everything. Actually, sorry, clean, grease, then Loctite. The one thing they are pretty notorious for is most of the brand new ones, they all get like a main pivot creak. It's a pretty nasty creak, but it's really easy to fix. You just pull it apart, clean, grease, Loctite. They have really good schematics on their website that you can find with all the torque specs. If you just torque everything to spec with Loctite, they generally hold together. Like my bike, I never had to touch really. I probably did that twice over the course of the race season when I was actually racing in like 2021 and riding quite a bit. They did have some production issues. I don't know anymore. It was kind of an early thing where they would have some issues, and they would take care of it for you, which was cool. Specialized stands behind their products, so I wouldn't be worried about that remotely. The frames do hold up. I haven't seen any crazy catastrophic failures online, so I'd say it's a solid product. I personally put mine through the ringer, and it held up fine, like I said, other than the head tube thing, but that was like, I raced the whole season on it and found out at the end. So all it would do is like a tiny bit of a creaky head tube, which is, I guess, kind of sketchy, but it was like just having a, creaky headset. So
yeah, that's the only issue that I've heard of people having, but I think the new ones are all good.
Yeah, I think they changed up their carbon layup partway through production to mitigate that. They do take things serious. That company does, maybe too serious at times, but they do care about their performance. They really do. So
yeah,
it's terrible.
We could go down that rabbit hole, but Nick tried the mullet. He didn't like it.
Yeah, no, we should just not even cut that one.
Well, I think that about covers it. It's a good bike. It has a really good suspension platform. A few quirks here and there. I think the main issue for both of us is the balance, but depending on your height and your sizing, just take that for what you will. I guess the last thing we didn't talk about is the climbing, but neither of us really care about that too much. So
you press the pedals, you sit on the seat, the bike goes up the hill. It climbs. You just got to pedal.
It does the thing.
Yeah, like you don't buy this bike to climb. If you did, you're in the wrong. You bought the wrong bike. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we tolerate the climbing to get to the downhills, and then that's when we really start giving a crap. But I think that's our review. You got anything else?
No, I mean, if I was giving the bike out of a 10 rating, it's a 9. Like, it's a really, really good bike. Like, if you buy this and you're disappointed, then I don't know. I was really happy, and like obviously, like, sounds like I'm complaining about the bigger one. It's just like a preference thing. But the S3, phenomenal bike. I have a lot of fun riding that. It's my brother's bike. I borrowed it for this. But yeah, thanks, Peter.
Yeah. If I were to give the bike a rating, I'd be a little lower. I'd say it's a 7. I'd say it's a really solid package. But for me, when I'm pushing it, and I kind of am a little bit more pigeonholed in the S4 just because of my height, and my struggles with this bike in that size kind of just doesn't give me the most confidence or the most fun. So like if I had a big quiver out of all the bikes I've ever ridden, I wouldn't reach for this first, I don't think. But it's hard to deny that it's a solid package. It's easy to get along with, I think, just for what I'm looking for out of a bike. It's got some shortcomings, but hopefully this video helped you guys out if you own one or if you're looking to buy one. And I think that's about it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you'd like, and we'll see you guys in the next video.